This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Stay tuned for an exclusive offer on how you can get 3 months free through Staged Right. It's 2024 and Broadway is about to get a brand new version of Cabaret by way of London. I've always loved this musical, whether it's the stage version or the iconic Bob Fosse film adaptation, even watching the dramatization of its production in FX's Fosse Verdon. Like, seriously, I nerd out over this stuff. The material, of course, has always carried a pervading darkness, provoking and shocking audiences through the years, and today's turbulent political climate makes that darkness feel all the more prescient. This episode of Staged Right is going to explore the origins of the musical, the people who contributed to its many incarnations, and how these influences and changes have created one of the most powerful and enduring musicals ever created. Before we get started, if you're new here and want to see more content like this, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. Also, I'm very happy to share that today's video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Now, if you've watched some of my episodes on this channel, you know I do a lot of research, and sometimes I have to get creative in how I look things up. For instance, while researching Christopher Isherwood for this episode, I wanted to rewatch Tom Ford's film version of A Single Man, but found it was not available to stream in my country. But after connecting to Surfshark and looking through different servers, I found the movie streaming on Amazon Prime in the UK. Nice. With a membership to Surfshark VPN, you can safely and privately link to servers around the world by connecting to a new IP without any worry about malware or third parties collecting your personal information. Surfshark encrypts all of your data between the device and the internet, and its clean web feature blocks ads on all websites or apps that you visit. It's an amazing tool in my research and one that can help you expand your streaming options from home and safely online. Try Surfshark out yourself today. Enter the coupon code STAGEDRIGHT for an extra 3 months free at surfshark.deals/stagedright. The musical of Cabaret began with what is essentially called the Berlin Stories, written by English writer Christopher Isherwood, with his novel Goodbye to Berlin being the core inspiration for the musical. The book comprises of 6 short stories, chronicling Isherwood's time in Berlin through the waning years of the Weimar Republic. Of the many characters we encounter, he describes his weathered and steadfast landlady, Fräulein Schroeder, his friend Otto Novak, and a peculiar young English girl by the name of Sally Bowles.
As she dialed the number, I noticed that her fingernails were painted emerald green, a color unfortunately chosen, for it called attention to her hands, which were much stained by cigarette smoking and as dirty as a little girl's. Her face was long and thin, powdered dead white, and she had very large brown eyes, which should have been darker to match her hair and the pencil she used for her eyebrows.
The woman he describes here is in fact Jean Ross, just 19 when she came to Berlin, with hopes of a career as an actress. The divinely decadent Sally Bowles would become an exaggerated representation of Jean, though Isherwood did include several autobiographical details, including her pregnancy and eventual abortion while in Berlin, translating into one of the more harrowing chapters of the book. Jean would give Isherwood her blessing to publish the Sally Bowles story, a decision that in time she would come to regret. Released in 1939, parts of Goodbye to Berlin read forebodingly, as Isherwood describes the escalating political and economic turbulence that finally gave way to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. Within months of the novel's release, Germany would invade Poland, which ultimately began the Second World War. Goodbye to Berlin was respectively received by critics, though some, like the New York Times, called the small book of sketches slight and without much merit. They also criticized what they referred to as Isherwood's perverse and confusing device of bestowing the narrator with his own name, while warning the reader that not everything in the novel was autobiographical. The Christopher Isherwood of Goodbye to Berlin is a remote figure. He opens the book professing, "I am a camera, with its shutter open, quite passive, recording, not thinking." The narrator offers only the most perfunctory of interjections, and while the author wished to deny the reader any right to assume anything was autobiographical, he leaves us subtle clues. leaving the reader to make up their own mind. In 1951, the book was adapted into a Broadway play, I Am a Camera, by British writer and friend of Christopher Isherwood, John Van Druten. Julie Harris, who earned her first Tony Award for this performance, would reprise the role of Sally Bowles for the 1955 film version of the play.
I've been most divinely chaste.
Those familiar with the more recent iterations of Isherwood's stories may find themselves off-put by this movie. Dare I say, underwhelmed. There are familiar tropes we recognize, like the budding romance between Natalia and Fritz, but the film reads as a never-ending farce. Isherwood playing the enduring straight man, pun intended, to Sally's capricious whims. The looming rise of the Nazis is almost an afterthought here. Its peripheral treatment ironically undermining the power of the original source material. By the beginning of the 1960s, several librettists had tried their hand at turning this tricky tale into a musical, including Sheldon Harnick, who, having given the material a go, said, "It can't be done." Enter Harold Prince. The man who would one day help in shaping the future of the musical theater got his start as an office boy, working for legendary director George Abbott, eventually cutting his teeth as a stage manager on Broadway shows like Call Me Madam and Wonderful Town, then trying his hand as a producer on shows like Pajama Game, West Side Story, and Fiddler on the Roof. By 1963, he had achieved his first success as a director with the original production of She Loves Me. While Prince had made his living working in the musical theater, he noted its tendency to dwell in artifice and cheap emotion. Driven to create political and socially conscious work, he found a worthy challenge in adapting Christopher Isherwood's dark material to the stage. By the time book writer Joe Masteroff had completed his first draft, Hal Prince and fellow Broadway producer David Black found themselves developing two different versions of the Isherwood stories, with Black's version helmed by British writer Sandy Wilson, writing book, music, and score. Keith Garabian writes in his book on the making of Cabaret that Masteroff's impression of Sandy Wilson's treatment seemed off, not so much evoking the spirit of Weimar Berlin, but the lighter pastiche feel of Wilson's previous musical, The Boyfriend. In the end, David Black's option for the rights expired, and were ultimately secured by Hal Prince. Hiring composer John Kander and lyricist Fred Ebb, the team set to work on creating their interpretation of the Isherwood stories.
For a long time, the four of us sat around and talked and talked and talked and talked and played what if? What if this? What if he throws a rock through the window? What if she has an abortion? What if... This has happened in a lot of shows since, and it's a wonderful way to work, where you just let your imagination run free. And eventually, by the time we finished playing What If, we were all working on the same project, rather than going in four different directions.
From these discussions came the creation of a character that does not appear in the Berlin stories. Rather, it was inspired by an experience of Hal Prince outside of Stuttgart, while serving in the U.S. Army in the early 1950s.
The war was just over, so everything was just demolished in Germany. I hung out in a little bar in Stuttgart called Maxim's, which was in a bombed-out church, and there was a little guy, an MC, with lots of makeup and eyeshadow and stuff, and there were three huge Valkyrie ladies in diaphanous gowns galumphing around. And you'd have a couple of drinks and watch him try to get a small audience into it, enthusiastic. And he was very obsequious and hardworking, sweat a lot.
In the Isherwood stories, we are given glimpses of clubs like the Troika, the Salome, and Lady Windermere's Fan, where Sally sometimes sings. For the musical, Prince wanted a singular club, the Kit Kat Club, to become a metaphor for Berlin in the 1930s. All overseen by a master of ceremonies who would ultimately deceive the audience, who, like the people of Germany, would be taken down the fatal path to fascism. For the part of the MC, Hal Prince hired 34-year-old Joel Grey, a little-known Broadway performer, an old friend, who had cut his teeth working the nightclub circuit. Often contested as the first concept musical, Cabaret became part of a string of shows, especially involving Hal Prince, where the show was developed from its themes, rather than the linear storytelling of most Golden Age musicals.
There were two musicals on stage. One took place in real rooms and one took place in limbo. And in limbo were these numbers which indirectly commented on the real book upstage.
Cabaret's conceptual nature would be realized by set designer Boris Aronson. Having made his mark in Yiddish theater, Aronson excelled at the surreal and abstract, most recently on the designs for Fiddler on the Roof, of which Hal Prince had been producer. One of the most striking elements of his design for Cabaret was a trapezoidal mirror suspended above the stage. As the audience entered, the first thing they saw was themselves. During the opening number, the mirror would tilt, reflecting the action from the stage back to the audience from a grotesquely omniscient angle. Hal Prince's production would ask its audience to look inward, how they may react to the escalating crisis, while also reflecting on how Berlin of the 1930s mirrored the society of the day. Hal Prince would impart this idea on the first day of rehearsal in the fall of 1966, sharing a recent edition of Life magazine. A photo featuring a group of snarling white supremacists was not taken in Nazi Germany, but in Chicago, Illinois just a few weeks earlier, part of a counter-protest where Martin Luther King and supporters had planned to march peacefully through white neighborhoods that had refused to rent to African Americans, and things did not go well.
Well, this is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago.
Cabaret would then represent not just a specific moment in history, but a transcendent cautionary tale about the horrors that come in light of human apathy. The first-person cast for the premiere production was Lotte Lenya, playing Fräulein Schneider, the musical's matronly but sympathetic landlady. In this version, Schneider is given a suitor, the elderly Herr Schultz, a Jewish grocer who rents a room in her boarding house. Already a legend in her own right, Lotte Lenya came to prominence in Weimar Berlin, originating the role of Jenny in 1928's The Threepenny Opera, written by Bertolt Brecht and her eventual husband, Kurt Weill. Lenya's brittle and expressive voice grounded Cabaret firmly in the story's period. Candor and Ebscore would be greatly influenced by Kurt Weill's work. Full of wit and biting irony, Lotte Lenya's blessing of their work was genuine, later telling John Kander, "When I walk on stage and sing those songs, it is Berlin." For casting the role of Sally, Hal Prince wanted to take a different approach, rather than hiring, say, a musical theater star. In Goodbye to Berlin, Christopher Isherwood paints the picture of a mediocre performer, writing, "She had a surprisingly deep, husky voice. She sang badly, without any expression, her hands hanging down at her sides. Yet her performance was, in its own way, effective because of her startling appearance, and her air of not caring a curse what people thought of her, her arms hanging carelessly limp, and a take-it-or-leave-it grin on her face." After auditioning some 239 women for the part, Hal Prince made a controversial gamble on British actress Jill Hayworth. Mainly a film actress, she had never sung professionally, and only after some coaxing from Prince did she finally accept the role. Joe Masteroff's rendering of Sally Bowles was at least in relation to the respective versions of Isherwood and Van Druten, though the fate of Masteroff's Sally is far bleaker. The creatives did not shy from depicting Sally's abortion, unlike John Collier's 1955 screenplay for I Am a Camera, though, in fairness, this was to appease the censors of the time. To glibly do away with the subject, the film's way of terminating her pregnancy is a mere human error.
You see, darling, I never was much good at arithmetic.
This, of course, at the cost of a pivotal plot point, with Christopher Isherwood later clarifying, "The abortion is the moment of truth, which tests Sally and proves that no misfortune, however drastic, can shock her out of her fantasy world." In the show's penultimate title number, Sally's abandon to the fantasy world is elevated by Prince's original staging, where in the middle of the song, the character seemingly steps off the stage of the Kit Kat Club, out of the real world, and stands alone in nothingness. This was bold stuff for a musical. Still, the creatives needed to toe the line in other respects, especially with regards to the material's queerness. The MC would maintain his maniacal androgyny, a moment showing two men dancing together, mainly serving as a joke to launch into a scene's next beat. But the Isherwood character, suspiciously vague and asexual in other interpretations, would be made heterosexual for Cabaret in 1966, and having a romance with Sally. Joe Masteroff felt more comfortable writing for an American, thus how Clifford Bradshaw was born. Bradshaw, by the way, is Christopher Isherwood's middle name, as well as the surname Isherwood himself gives the narrator for Mr. Norris Changes Trains, as seen in the Berlin stories. One of the last crucial elements that came in for Cabaret was Joel Grey's performance. He had been pleased with what the creatives had put together, but also rather baffled by the scant details given about the MC. After weeks of rehearsal, Joel Grey was starting to panic. He wanted to embody an actual person, not just the show's metaphor. He then remembered being on tour years before in St. Louis, and seeing what he remembered being told as the hottest act in town.
I remembered a dreadful, second-rate, fourth-rate, fifth-rate, whatever he was, a comedian that I saw once, and I said, that guy is the worst, sleaziest, classlessest performer I've ever seen. And one day I was trying to find this character, and I thought of this guy, and I did an imitation of him, and it was horrible to do. And I finished it, and Hal Prince came over to me and said, that's it.
This was the key to unlocking the character, suddenly finding inspiration for the MC's seedy and sordid backstory. Joel Grey would take his cue for the look of the MC from Hal Prince's original inspiration. Digging through then-wife Joe Wilder's makeup kit, he matted his hair down, parting it in the middle, donning blue eyeshadow, a pink makeup stick called Juvenile Pink, and used eyelashes caked in mascara. His appearance at the top of the show set the mood for the evening.
Welcome and bienvenue, welcome. Frères, étrangers, strangers. Glücklich zu sehen, je suis enchanté. Happy to see you, bleibe, reste, stay.
The out-of-town tryouts in Boston were successful, though there was still work to be done there. The show's original 3-act version would be trimmed down to 2 at the suggestion of George Abbott. Allegedly in this version, Jill Hayworth's Sally inexplicably wore 3 different colored wigs for each act. Blonde for one, red for the second, and a dark brown for the third.
Welcome and bienvenue, welcome you!
Incidentally, there are quite a few photos of Jill Hayworth in Cabaret donning a blonde wig, only to have photos of the very same scene with a dark one. This is the look that the creatives ultimately settled with. The color of Sally's wigs, however, would end up being the least of Jill Hayworth's troubles, which we'll talk about later on. While the musical's creatives had intended for certain moments to provoke or shock the audience, 2 particular moments drew unexpected backlash in Boston. First was the end of Act 1, during the reprise of Tomorrow Belongs to Me, where an engagement party suddenly succumbs to an imperious Nazi anthem. Keith Garabian writes in his book, The Making of Cabaret, that the song was so plausibly performed in actual performance that it was denounced as a grossly offensive Nazi anthem. The song, of course, had been written for the production. In the original staging, the MC takes in the scene, turns to the audience, shrugs, and after a leering smile, simply exits. Garabian goes on to say that with his participation in this song, the MC completes the impression of an evil host, his cabaret now a mirror reflection of a nation on the cusp of fascism. Audiences in Boston were given a further jolt early in the second act. After a fraught scene between Fräulein Schneider and Herr Schultz, the MC reappears, accompanied by a gorilla in a tutu. Through the song, If You Could See Her Through My Eyes, he earnestly implores the audience to live and let live, even on this unusual love. To first nighters, this number must have seemed like a relief, more vaudeville than biting satirical cabaret numbers. That is until the number's closing lyric.
But if you could see her She wouldn't look Jewish at all.
Audience members, especially those who were Jewish, were incensed, quickly denouncing the song, baffling and frustrating Cabaret's creative team, who were all Jewish themselves. The song proved so dangerous to the success of the show that during previews in New York, Hal Prince had the lyric changed to,
She isn't a misguide at all.
This, of course, was in reference to Herr Schultz's Act 1 number, Mieskeit, the Yiddish word for ugly one. It was admittedly an inferior alternative, a change that all creatives on Cabaret resented. But it quickly remedied a dangerous situation before opening night, though Jill Gray would admit to the occasional slip and singing the first version in performance. The original lyric would be reinstated for Cabaret's London premiere, but American audiences would have to wait until the show's movie adaptation.
She wouldn't look Jewish at all.
Lotte Lenya was given one final number in the show. When she tells Cliff and Sally that she has reconsidered her engagement to Herr Schultz, Cliff says that she cannot give in to the threat of the Nazis, to which Schneider rebukes him with the song, What Would You Do? This moment represents a change from John Van Druten's rendering of the character, and a nod, if not a return, to Christopher Isherwood's original intention. He had based the character on his actual landlady, Meta Tarot, while staying in Berlin. Like all characters in his stories, he gave them an alias and distorted life details, though he would years later acknowledge that Fräulein Schroeder in Goodbye to Berlin was the least distorted character in the book. In both the play and film version of I Am a Camera, John Van Druten alters Isherwood's landlady to serve a dramatic purpose. Overwhelmed by inflation and Germany's dire circumstances, she, like many, becomes susceptible to the Nazis' rhetoric.
It is the Jews, believe me, a plot to bring the country down.
Oh, you know, that's absolute rubbish.
While Isherwood understood the change for I Am a Camera, he worried that Tarot might take offense of her character spewing anti-Semitic sentiments of which she never harbored in real life. At Isherwood's request, John Van Druten changed the character from Schroeder to Schneider, so as to hopefully reassure Tarot that the landlady of I Am a Camera was not intended to be a portrait of her. With the rights to the Isherwood stories intrinsically linked to that of John Van Druten's play, the character's name remained Fräulein Schneider for Cabaret, but one can easily recognize that Joe Masteroff's rendering of Schneider owes a greater debt to Isherwood than Van Druten. Even without the Herr Schultz romance, Schneider is a survivor, and she, like countless others, will adapt themselves to the coming disaster.
Almost every musical has a song which is central. She sang an apology for not doing anything when the Nazis came to power. That moment was it. And I thought what it did so adroitly was the audience asked themselves that question. And if they were honest with themselves, quite a number of people in that audience would have done nothing either and be shamefaced because of it.
Cabaret opened on Broadway to rave reviews in November of 1966. The show would go on to win 8 Tony Awards in 1967, the year of the first nationally televised ceremony, winning awards for Best Musical, Score, Director, and Joel Grey for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. The production was not without its detractors. Some critics took issue with Joe Masteroff's book, particularly the lamentably conventional love stories that stood in stark contrast of the garish and gritty cabaret world. But no one received worse criticism than Jill Hayworth as Sally Bowles. In his New York Times review, Walter Kerr called her the production's single and all too obvious mistake, brutally summarizing her to be a damaging presence, worth no more to the show than her weight in mascara. I've come across varying reports in my research about Jill Hayworth's time in Cabaret, so-called inconsistencies in her performance. Lotte Lenya, who had supported Hayworth through the brutal reviews, recalled a day about 4 weeks into the run, where she remarked on how bored she was in the show.
I said, get the hell out of the theater. You have no right to be here if you say that, you know? If you don't enjoy it until the very last moment, until the show closes, then you have no right to be in the theater.
It should be noted that Jill Hayworth stayed with Cabaret for a year and a half. Beyond the original cast album and a few appearances on the Tonys as Sally Bowles, there is, of course, no readily available record of her performance. Interestingly, most people recall Judi Dench's take on the part in London in 1968. Like Hayworth, she had never sung professionally before playing Sally Bowles, but the memory of her performance has endured, no doubt aided by a long and varied career with triumphs in the theater, film, and television world. Sadly for Jill Hayworth, Cabaret marked a turning point in her career, a career that never seemed to find its footing in the ensuing years. Upon her death in 2011, Hal Prince would reflect that the critics underestimated her. Sally Bowles was not supposed to be a professional singer. She wasn't supposed to be so slick that you forgot she was an English girl somewhat off the rails in the Weimar era. Joel Grey would recall, "She had a wild abandon about herself and her life. I understood why Hal chose her. She was so Sally Bowles." By the time the film version of Cabaret began shooting in 1971, there had already been 2 failed ventures, one of which involved a treatment written by Christopher Isherwood and his partner, Don Bacardi. Ultimately, the film rights would be secured by Allied Artists and ABC Pictures in a joint effort to present the film. Broadway producer Cy Feuer, acting as co-producer on the movie of Cabaret, would hire J. Presson Allen to write the screenplay, and was clear from the beginning that the movie version would be very different from what appeared on stage, something of a return to the spirit of the Berlin stories, while also taking risks in presenting the material's more subversive elements. Many of the songs from the stage version would be cut, leaving Kander and Ebb to write new songs as indicated in J. Allen's screenplay. Allied Artists, recently under financial strain, needed to ensure that Cabaret was a success, and not long after acquiring the film rights, soon began conversations with Liza Minnelli. The daughter of legendary performer Judy Garland and Hollywood director Vincent Minnelli, she had already worked with Kander and Ebb on Flora and the Red Menace on Broadway, winning a Tony for Best Leading Actress at just 19 years old. She had been considered for the part of Sally Bowles on Broadway, but Hal Prince ultimately thought her talents too extraordinary to convincingly play a mediocre performer. By the time she began discussions for the film, she'd made a name for herself touring her club act around the world and receiving an Academy Award nomination for her performance in The Sterile Cuckoo. With Isherwood's rendering of Sally in mind, Liza still wasn't an obvious choice to play the role, but looking to capitalize on her rising star, executives thought it was easier to build the part around her. It would be one in a series of compromises and adjustments to both the Isherwood stories and the stage version. Liza's casting is clearly in mind in J. Allen's first draft of the screenplay, with references to a gamine American who is in fact very talented. After consulting her father, Liza fashioned her Sally Bowles off of Louise Brooks, donning fake eyelashes, dyeing her hair black, and cutting it into a helmet-like coif. Hailing from Cherryvale, Kansas, Louise Brooks had actually spent time in Weimar, Germany as an actress, notably in movies like Lulu and Pandora's Box, making the idea of an American Sally Bowles at least plausible. Upon later viewing the film, Christopher Isherwood thought Liza, quote, clumsy and utterly wrong for the part. And it's true that some may find a clearly extraordinary performer like this slumming in a third-rate nightclub a bit of a stretch. Personally, even with its Americanness, I still think the crux of Sally's mercurial, irresistible charm remains. The screenplay does away with Fräulein Schneider's romance with Herr Schultz. Schneider, in fact, is practically a background character in this version, and it reinterpolates the romance from I Am a Camera, Natalia, a wealthy Jewish heiress, and Fritz, her apparently Gentile suitor. One of the biggest changes was making the musical numbers diegetic, confining them to the Kit Kat Club. They'd still provide commentary on the story, and the cabaret retaining its metaphor for Berlin's decadence, but everything existed more or less in reality. This approach would be far more palatable for audiences of the time that had grown impatient with the classic conventions of movie musicals. Bob Fosse, of course, knew that firsthand, having just experienced a colossal failure for his directorial debut on the movie version of Sweet Charity, of which he had originally conceived, directed, and choreographed for the stage. Only after name directors like Gene Kelly and Billy Wilder declined, did the studio finally offer him the job. It was, in the most practical sense, a job for Bob Fosse, perhaps his chance of redemption after the failure of Sweet Charity. But something inherent in Cabaret clearly spoke to Fosse. Having grown up performing in the seedy burlesque houses of Chicago, he had begun to learn, all too early, about the darker side of show business that seduces and corrupts. The film of Cabaret was shot on location in and around Munich. To evoke the decadence of the period, Fosse drew inspiration from Weimar artists like Otto Dix and George Gross, and to emphasize the roughness of the Kit Kat Club, Fosse instructed his dancers to de-glam for the camera. All of them were to gain weight, grow out their armpit hair, pluck their eyebrows before drawing them in with pencil. While still utilizing technical skill, Fosse's choreography on Cabaret would intentionally subvert the precision of his Broadway work, later explaining, quote, "I try to make the dances look not as if they were done by me, Bob Fosse, but by some guy who is down and out. His work on Mein Herr, a song written for the movie, is a good example of this. Taking inspiration from Marlene Dietrich in The Blue Angel, the number has his dancers go through a series of straddling positions and poses. These poses proved so challenging to balance that Fosse had the chairs nailed to the floor. A fun fact that maybe not everyone knows, contrary to what some have written, the song Maybe This Time wasn't actually written for the movie version of Cabaret. In fact, Liza had been singing it in concert for years by then, and only after a suggestion to Fosse was it eventually added to the movie, almost like it was meant for this specific moment. This would indeed be a Bob Fosse movie, but it was still a Cy-Fure production, and the two would often jockey for power behind the scenes. Executives had overridden Fosse in casting Joel Grey as the MC, the only original cast member to appear in the movie. On stage, his MC had been given room for broad spontaneity, but on film, Fosse wanted the MC's movements stylized, with every gesture and step set to counts. A choice that Joel Grey found unnatural, especially having played the role hundreds of times by then. An air of tension would remain between the two throughout the movie's production. Only years later would Joel Grey be more open to discuss this, ultimately reflecting that despite their difficulties, the struggle had been worth it. More than worth it, he would say. Fosse would also clash with J. Preston Allen with regards to her screenplay. She would later recall, "I didn't find him the happiest collaborator I ever had. For a man who dealt with women as much as he was obliged to, let's say he had an extremely parochial view of women." She would end up suggesting her friend and fellow collaborator, Hugh Wheeler, to revise her script.
I knew that Hugh could do it and would be easy to work with, and I didn't think Hugh would kill my baby, and he didn't.
Still retaining much of J. Allen's original work, Fosse and Wheeler's revisions recalibrated the story's focus, particularly on the central relationship. The Isherwood character would be played by Michael York, or as I knew him growing up, Basil from Austin Powers, thus making the character British once more. Named Brian Roberts in this version, he is depicted as bisexual, carrying on a romantic relationship with Sally, while also sharing an attraction to the wealthy Max von Hoyen. Christopher Isherwood would eventually air his grievances over the depiction of Brian's bisexuality, what he called homosexual tendencies, and how the hint of these lapses were treated as an indecent but comic weakness to be snickered at, like bedwetting. Personally, watching this movie in 2024, I don't read Brian's queerness being treated pejoratively here. If anything, that's bestowed upon the brief appearance of Elka, a performer who works at the Kit Kat Club. There's actually a line that jumped out at me while reading J. Allen's original screenplay, a line which was ultimately cut, where Sally talks about Elka's being forced by the club's management to use the men's room. Though of course, this is more of a joke at her expense than, say, a prescient conversation about gender.
Wait till he gets a load of what little old Elky's got.
One of the things that the movie does very well is depicting the growing presence of the Nazis in 1930s Germany. At first, their presence is subtle, on the fringes. A decrepit man bearing a swastika riding past Brian and Sally on the sidewalk, a young SA officer attending the Kit Kat Club. What makes the later scenes chilling is watching the characters sleepwalk through the politically turbulent Berlin with a terrifying lack of awareness. In this scene, a German radio broadcast reports about a street fight that is instigated by the Nazis, resulting in 3 arrests. But the tenants of Fräulein Schneider's, preoccupied in their own respective worlds, do not take notice. When they literally drive through the grisly remnants of a street brawl, Brian, Max, and particularly Sally are rather cavalier, detached from what they see.
Hey, Max, can we go to the Bristol bar?
Why not?
Oh, wonderful. I'm dying to show off my new coat.
Things become clear all too late in the beer garden scene, with patrons joining the Hitler Youth and singing the rousing "Tomorrow Belongs to Me." Bob Fosse apparently regretted the scene, possibly because it's the one song that takes place outside of the Kit Kat Club, but it's still a potent and disturbingly powerful moment in the film. And this last shot with Joel Grey, one of the closest we get to the MC's limbo world, is just damn right chilling. Cabaret would go on to win 8 Oscars, including Best Director for Fosse, Best Actress for Liza, with Joel Grey winning Best Featured Actor, joining the handful of actors who have won both a Tony and Oscar for playing the same role.
Don't let anybody tell you this isn't a terrific thrill.
The one major award the film didn't win that night was Best Picture, which went to a little movie called The Godfather. Cabaret's distinct style, particularly with Liza, would reverberate through pop culture in the years to come, from fashion icons like Pat McGrath and Jean-Paul Gaultier. Even Alice Cooper, who later told Liza Minnelli that her performance in Cabaret helped shape his own stage persona, and despite the mark of later versions, the influence of the movie has transcended even them. For instance, in the second season of Schmigadoon, the character of Jenny Banks isn't referencing Christopher Isherwood's British Sally Bowles, but Liza's American Sally Bowles, and Bob Fosse's style is obviously referenced here. Speaking of style, in its fierce aversion to sentiment, Bob Fosse's film brilliantly harnesses the stage musical's Brechtian techniques, removing the audience from the action in order to observe it from a distance, more objectively. Fosse adopts these techniques again in 1979's All That Jazz, a barely veiled portrait of his own struggles with addiction as a Broadway director and choreographer. Rob Marshall's 2002 film adaptation of Chicago, a quintessential Bob Fosse musical, also utilizes these techniques to thrilling effect. This influence and style reverberate on in movie musicals like Hedwig and the Angry Inch, Tick Tick Boom, and appropriately so, throughout the FX Limited series Fosse Verdon. It's almost become a Fosse filmmaking language. His efforts to dazzle while grounding us in reality would go on to reverberate to future versions of Cabaret. In August of 1994, Matt Wolf of The New York Times wrote, "There's a heart of darkness to many a Broadway musical, but these days it seems it's the British who lay it bare." The article goes on to discuss, amongst other productions, the then recent staging of Cabaret in London, directed by Sam Mendes, transforming the tiny Donmar warehouse into an actual cabaret space. The immersive production featured Jane Horrocks as Sally Bowles, with Alan Cumming in a completely reconceived performance as the MC. The production was a success, eventually being filmed for UK's Channel 4. American industry members noted the production's impact, far more impactful than the recent 1987 Broadway revival just a few years before. Even with Joel Grey reprising his performance as the MC, many felt Hal Prince's staging, in many respects identical to the original, had not stood the test of time, perhaps tampered by memories of the movie. Todd Haynes of the Roundabout Theatre Company agreed to bring the production to Broadway, with Alan Cumming reprising the role of the MC, and Natasha Richardson set to play Sally Bowles. She, of course, was the daughter of British actress Vanessa Redgrave, who had been Hal Prince's second choice to play Sally in the original London production. The revival of this particular production would be delayed nearly 2 years, with Sam Mendes insistent on setting the show in an immersive space, rather than the typical Broadway theater. They finally landed with the Henry Miller Theater on West 43rd Street. This is the site where the Stephen Sondheim Theater stands today. The Roundabout Theater Company would rename the Henry Miller the Kit Kat Club, receiving a breathtaking transformation for this production.
This used to be a theatre, but it stopped being a theatre 30 years ago. It became a cinema, and it then became a club. So what we were doing was turning a theatre that was a club back into a theatre in order to turn it into a club again.
Sam Mendes' version of Cabaret upped the ante on depicting the degradation of Berlin in the 1930s. In the Kit Kat Club, random chase light bulbs enveloping the space would be out, sometimes smashed in. Costumes, or lack thereof, would be in various states of disintegration, and Rob Marshall's choreography was lewd and sexually charged. It was dark, perverse, and totally disarming. Joe Masteroff would supply rewrites for this revival, particularly concerning Cliff's bisexuality. It was subtly referenced in the 1987 revival, but in 1998 it was depicted much more frankly. Alan Cummings' MC was more debauched, confrontational with performers on stage and members of the audience. His MC omnisciently oversaw nearly every moment of the evening, even the scenes outside of the Kit Kat Club, as if they too were part of a cabaret performance. His presence in the usually sentimental "It Couldn't Please Me More" alerts the audience, insidiously hinting at something grave to come. When Cliff proposes his commitment to building a life with Sally, the MC drifts into the scene, placing a microphone before her, removing herself from the scene so she can sing "Maybe This Time." This, of course, interpolates one of the better-known songs from the movie, while also justifying a vulnerability that she wouldn't typically betray to another person. As before, the cabaret remains the metaphor for Germany, and the MC our complicit guide to fascism. This production humanizes him, somewhat, if only to emphasize the toll of his corruption. As he bids farewell to the audience at the end of the show, the MC removes his jacket to reveal the clothes of a concentration camp prisoner, bearing the Star of David and a pink triangle. For perjuring himself as our guide toward fascism, the MC ultimately seals his fate and completes his own self-destruction. Ben Brantley of the New York Times wasn't convinced of the production, finding Sam Mendes and co-director Rob Marshall going out of their way to shock the audience, in turn compromising the concept that was set by the original creators. He writes, "When Mr. Cumming, with spangled nipples peeking out from beneath a black leather trench coat, tells the audience to leave its troubles outside, and that in here life is beautiful, he is all too obviously lying. The carnal, gyrating chorus of men and women, who specifically simulate assorted sexual positions, look ill and spent, like denizens in an S&M bar who have already let the games go on too long. There's nothing seductive about them, and the experience of cabaret has to be one of illicit seduction." What he did respond to was Natasha Richardson's performance of Sally Bowles. From the few clips floating around of her playing this role, we see a more subdued Sally from the flittering, by then caricatured take we've become accustomed to. She's rough around the edges, unpolished, something of a callback to Christopher Isherwood's version.
Oh, just put it anywhere, darling. I'll unpack later. Unpack? But Herr Bradshaw did not mention... Oh, I'll just be here temporarily. I am sorry, but this is not possible. How much are you paying?
50 marks.
60 marks. It is not the money. 70. I cannot permit... 80. 85. Done.
In his 1998 review of the show, Ben Brantley particularly praised her penultimate scene. Wearing the barest of little black dresses, and her eyes shimmering with fever, she looks raw, brutalized, and helplessly exposed. And now she's going to sing us a song, an anthem to hedonism, about how life is a cabaret, old chum. She might as well be inviting you to hell. What Miss Richardson does is reclaim and reinvent a showbiz anthem that is as familiar as Hamlet's soliloquy. She hasn't made the number her own in the way nightclub performers bring distinctive, quirky readings to standards. She has given it back to Sally Bowles. Miss Richardson, you see, isn't selling the song, she's selling the character. As she forges ahead with the number in a defiant, metallic voice, you can hear the promise of the lyrics tarnishing in Sally's mouth. She's willing herself to believe in them, and all too clearly losing the battle. In Hal Prince's version, Sally surrenders to fantasy. In Sam Mendes' version, Sally surrenders to defeat, knowing that she's giving into a life that will ultimately destroy her. The production won Tonys for Natasha Richardson, Alan Cumming, Ron Rifkin, who played Herr Schultz, and ultimately the Tony for Best Revival of a Musical. After transferring to Studio 54, the production would run for nearly 6 years on Broadway, and at least according to my research, is the longest running production of Cabaret anywhere. The same way that Bob Fosse's Cabaret subverted Hal Prince's version, the aesthetics of Sam Mendes' production would become definitive in the eyes of many, and having seen many an amateur production of Cabaret, I can tell you that is very true. While the 2012 London production by Rufus Norris bore a revamped look, Sam Mendes' production was revived on Broadway in 2014, with Alan Cumming reprising the role of the MC, featuring Michelle Williams as Sally Bowles, later replaced by Emma Stone. But just as before, a cabaret for a new generation has arrived. Now, disclaimer, I haven't seen the Rebecca Frecknell production yet, and the way ticket prices are set, I don't see that happening anytime soon. Other than the production's premium ticket prices, the production's immersive concept has been a huge part of its advertising. This, of course, was a huge part of Sam Mendes' grimy and gritty version, but Rebecca Frecknell's production takes its cue of seduction from Hal Prince's original concept. Cabaret is trying to create complicity with the audience, she told The Times. It welcomes the audience in order to then do something to them later on. So how do we do that now? How do we pull the rug out from under the audience? Working with designer Tom Scott, they painstakingly transformed London's Playhouse Theatre from a proscenium space into an in-the-round cabaret space. Upon entering, audience members are offered a drink, walking through twisted neon-lit hallways, before entering a lavish bar area leading to the auditorium. Performers mingle with patrons, playing instruments. They vogue and they whack and pull people up on the stage. True to Cabaret, the audience enters a strange world, but the production meets the audience in the present. Designer Tom Scott said, "I wanted it to be as exciting as it feels for me to go to a queer party in East London now. It is about capturing an atmosphere that could be translated to 100 years ago, but more by skimming stones through time with decor and costumes. So it isn't relegated to something that happened in the past. You want a sense of history, but you also want it to feel prescient." The show opened to raves in December of 2021, featuring Eddie Redmayne as the MC and Jessie Buckley as Sally Bowles, later earning Olivier's for their respective performances, winning Best Revival of a Musical, and of course, Rebecca Frecknell for Best Director of a Musical. Now, hardly the first and solely queer-centric production of Cabaret. Take, for instance, Barrington Stage Company's 2023 staging of the piece. But one of the things that I really love about this version of Cabaret is its casting of queer and non-binary performers on a commercial stage. In 2023, Mason Alexander Park became the first openly non-binary actor to play the MC in the West End. The Broadway transfer, slated to begin performances in April of 2024, will also feature an ensemble of queer and non-binary actors, including Marty Lauder, otherwise known as Marsha from RuPaul's Drag Race, playing Victor and understudying the role of the MC. Reading of this new and modern Cabaret, I got to wondering what traditionalists, what fans of the movie or Alan Cumming's performance of the MC, might think of what seems to me a departure from what we've come to expect from Cabaret. One can only imagine what the author of the original story might make of it. It's maybe disappointing to know that despite its success, Christopher Isherwood was not fond of Cabaret. Confiding to his diary, he called the original production by Hal Prince a fifth-rate musical, later writing that he didn't even think that Bob Fosse's movie added up to much. Prince's failing to include him in the development of the show, as well as Isherwood's exclusion from the film adaptation, might have left him with some deep-felt resentment, though he was always happy to receive the profits those properties bestowed. Whatever the interpretation, Isherwood would always be disappointed in any variation of his work. There is an irony in this, for the variations of the facts he made in the Berlin stories would sometimes frustrate the subjects of which he studied, specifically Jean Ross, who inspired the character of Sally Bowles. She would come to resent her association with the character. During the original London run of Cabaret, members of the press dogged her to attend a performance, only to meet Judi Dench backstage before the cameras. Jean Ross refused. We can ask ourselves, why would she resent being associated with Sally Bowles? True, the character is charming and beloved by so many, but she does also have her share of less than endearing qualities. Maybe having such an unflattering portrait of yourself at such a young and formative age, following you throughout your life, might eventually grow tiresome, dare I say, embarrassing. In the Sally Bowles chapters, Isherwood has her spout anti-Semitic slurs, demonstrating an acute lack of political awareness, details that were simply incongruous with how people remembered Jean Ross. After leaving Berlin, Jean would join the Communist Party and work as a war correspondent during the Spanish Civil War. Many have come to speculate that the political apathy bestowed upon Sally was more in line with Christopher Isherwood's character. Surprising as this may be, the author of Goodbye to Berlin, as evidenced by his diaries, was often obliged to make misogynist and anti-Semitic remarks himself. I can also understand frustration on Jean's behalf, that for all the scrutiny she received as a model for Sally, the narrative structure of Goodbye to Berlin conceals much of the Isherwood character. No doubt Jean understood why, but perhaps she may have felt exploited by her friend. Isherwood would eventually revisit his time in Berlin in the memoir Christopher and His Kind, giving himself and the characters of the Berlin stories a more focused study. Of Jean, he wrote, "Jean was more essentially British than Sally. She grumbled like a true Englishwoman, and she was tougher. She never struck Christopher as being sentimental or the least bit sorry for herself." One of the more striking observations he has about Jean is his own grappling of her memory with the legacy of Sally Bowles. I wish I could remember what impression Jean Ross made on Christopher when they first met, but I can't. Art has transfigured life, and other people's art has transfigured Christopher's art. What remains with me from those early years is almost entirely Sally. Beside her, like a reproachful sister, stands the figure of Jean as I knew her much later, and both Jean and Sally keep being jostled to one side of my memory to make way for the actresses who played the part of Sally on stage and on screen. These, regardless of their merits, are all much more vivid to me than either Jean or Sally. Their boldly made up, brightly lit faces are larger than life. In some ways, the clarification came all too late. Jean Ross died in 1973, 3 years before the publication of Christopher and His Kind, and by then the influence of Cabaret was undeniable, reverberating through pop culture. The distortions and ambiguity that Christopher Isherwood weaves throughout the Berlin stories have come to be interpreted and reinterpreted so many times that the characters and the musical itself are spoken of in almost mythic proportions, existing far beyond the source material. Throughout my research, I'm occasionally struck by the dissenting opinions between the creatives of the various versions of Cabaret, Isherwood's well-established dislike of the stage musical, Bob Fosse's efforts to make not so much a movie musical, but a movie with music, efforts that ultimately displeased book writer Joe Masteroff, who said, quote, "Fosse didn't believe that you could do serious musicals. His version of Cabaret is so much lighter than mine." I think we all will land differently on our favorite or preferred iterations of the story. I love Cabaret, and will always find a reason to come back and revisit it, whether it's the movie or a new stage production. I think the worst that any version could do is undermine the piece's initial instincts from 1966, to ask the audience to reflect and ask themselves what they would do in the dire situations these characters find themselves in. Maybe we might do things differently and make different decisions. Maybe not. But hopefully. So, what would you do? Thank you for watching this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to see more content like this. If you want to share your support in a flexible, affordable way, please consider a contribution to either my Patreon or Ko-fi accounts. Finally, another big thank you to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Try Surfshark out yourself today. Enter the coupon code STAGEDRIGHT for an extra 3 months free at surfshark.deals/stagedright. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.